Ladies and gentlemen, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you here this evening and those who are watching online. It's super to see so many people here, and I think you're going to have a very, very interesting evening. A couple of points I'd like to make before we start. If anybody is averse to being shown on the recording which is being made, please, perhaps you could just turn away if you're sitting here. For those watching online, perhaps you'd like to switch off the camera section, and then you won't feel compromised at all. You can still hear the proceedings. The other point that I'd like to make is, for those of you either here or watching online, you may not know that a wonderful lady called Marion Mallet died in January this year, and her funeral was yesterday. So I don't know if you can see that, or people watching, if that will show on the camera. But she was a founder member. Happily, she lived long enough to celebrate our 30th anniversary on the 5th of November. And I think she would be here in spirit with us today. So I'd like now to go on to our main topic of the evening, which is Sudetenland political refugees in 1938, the role of Labour MP David Grenfell in Prague. The topic is, will the question be answered despite the Munich Agreement's popularity in the UK as a means of avoiding war in September 1938? Why did the UK Conservative government, led by Neville Chamberlain, quickly support the opposition Labour Party proposal to send its people to Prague and Poland to help political refugees escape to the UK? The seminar investigates the actions taken by David Rhys Grenfell on behalf of the Labour Party. The speaker tonight, I'm very happy to introduce, is Rosamund Mykura. She is the daughter and granddaughter of Czech citizens who were German-speaking Social Democrat political refugees in 1938, following the Munich Agreement. She used the family archive to investigate in a range of archives the oral family history, according to which a Labour MP was on the ship making sure that they were safe. David Rhys Grenfell, MP for Gower, a former coal miner who became Secretary of Mines at the Board of Trade in the 1940 wartime government, was on that ship. And Rosamund will now tell you how that all came about, and no doubt about her extensive research.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this talk this evening. I'd like to thank the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies at the University of London for inviting me to speak this evening. The support of Dr. Jana Buresova, thank you, for my presentation is much appreciated. Jane Lewin has been a great help with practicalities. In Wales, I thank Dr. Robert Smith, whose new book published last year, Dr. Grenfell, Socialist, Welshman, Internationalist, has given much new information, some of which I have used this evening. In the Czech Republic, I thank historian Dr. Thomas Ullerman, a board member for the Seliger Gemeinde, which is the successor organization of the political party for which my grandparents worked. Within this building, thanks to the library's Germanic archives, which hold the Herbert Lowitt papers, which name my refugee family and also describe later meetings in the UK between Yaksh and others. So we're going to look this evening at the background to and the events following the Labour Party proposal for Czech refugees entering Britain from October 1938, so about a year before World War II started. It resulted in the successful first train escape from Prague, escorted by David Rhys Grenfell and Doreen Warriner, a volunteer British refugee worker. They accompanied 34 men from the political party, the DSAP, the Deutsche Sozialdemokratische Arbeiterpartei in der Czechoslovakia, the Social Democratic Workers' Party in Czechoslovakia. They escorted this group of men to safety in Poland onto a British ship. In this context, the word German means the Czech citizens who were living as a large, long-established German-speaking minority in the part of Czechoslovakia known as Sudetenland. We have slide 2, please. So this is the same map, but a little bigger. And the orange are the parts that were the Sudetenland that Hitler was told that he could walk in with his army and take. And the little black dots on the orange are where my family lived, worked, or were connected to. And we're going to start, please, with slide 3. Just to let you know what we're running through this evening. So the first half of the talk goes up to about number 6, and it's about what happened in the lead up. And the second half is the topics from 7 to 10. So we're going to start with who was who in the British government in 1938, which was led by the Conservative Party. Neville Chamberlain was the party leader and the UK's Prime Minister. Chamberlain told Hitler that his German army could invade and govern the Sudetenland area of Czechoslovakia. And this was the Munich Agreement, 30th of September, 1938. Chamberlain understandably wanted to avoid another war, only 20 years after the First World War, and he also wanted to give the British time to build up their armaments to fight Hitler. But despite Czechoslovakia being a separate small country and a successful new democracy, he felt that Czechoslovakia would have to give way to the greater powers. Appeasement of Hitler was also popular in Britain, and this was because the press largely supported government policy, while the government actively managed the press, the BBC, and cinema newsreels. Most Conservative MPs supported appeasement, but the Conservative Party Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, did not. So Eden was removed, and another Conservative, Lord Halifax, became Foreign Secretary about 6 months before the Munich Agreement. Winston Churchill was another Conservative Member of Parliament who opposed the appeasement of Hitler. Churchill said in Parliament at about the time of Munich, "The Sudeten miners, who are all Czechs and whose families have lived in that area for centuries, must now flee." He added, "Czechoslovakia will become engulfed in the Nazi regime." At this time, the Labour Party was the second largest party in the British Parliament and was led by Clement Attlee, who opposed appeasement of Hitler. Attlee was leader of the opposition in Parliament. And about this time, just after Munich, Attlee said, "There can be no doubt that it is a tremendous victory for Herr Hitler. Without firing a shot, by the mere display of military force, he has achieved a dominating position in Europe, which Germany failed to win after 4 years of war. He has overturned the balance of power in Europe. He has destroyed the last fortress of democracy in Eastern Europe, which stood in the way of his ambition." Attlee added, "I have had the privilege to to visit Czechoslovakia, and I know many of the Czechs. They are a fine, free, and democratic people. I know Sudeten Germans too. So we move on to look at Grenfell now. Who was he, and how did he develop his political ideas? So born in 1881, the young Grenfell was from a family of 7 children near Gower in South Wales. He left school aged 12 to work in his local pit, as did his father and brother. As a young adult, Grenfell went with his older brother and a friend, all Welsh speakers, to Nova Scotia in Canada, where they worked as miners for 2 years among other migrants from different lands speaking many tongues. This was where Grenfell first showed his ability to learn languages, for he was fluent in Welsh, English, French, and German. On returning home to work in the South Wales coalfield, Grenfell's political development continued. Before the First World War, in the Independent Labour Party, Grenfell developed his skills and education. For his work, he did correspondence courses on geology and mining, as well as local training organised by Swansea Technical College and Glamorgan Council. If a miner or a workman lost their life, there was no compensation, only 2 shillings a week from the parish. Colliery employment was spasmodic. Strikes were calamitous. Unemployment and underemployment recurred. The Independent Labour Party believed 2 prongs were necessary for the workers' advancement: trade union strength in the workplace and workers' representation in Parliament. In this sense, Grenfell's progress as both a miners' union official and a trade unionist MP, wresting control from the Liberals who came before him in South Wales, was emblematic of the electoral success of the Labour Party in Wales in the 20th century. If we fast forward to Grenfell's progression through qualifications until he had a first-class certificate as a colliery manager, we can see that this was not designed to lead to working in management. Instead, Grenfell went on to win the trade union election, where 25 candidates stood, and he became the miners' agent, which meant the trade union representative for the Western Miners section of the South Wales Miners' Federation. 6 years later, Grenfell was elected as MP for Gower, the area where he lived and worked. He was part of the Labour Party structures of the time. Grenfell was elected from 1931 to the Parliamentary Labour Party executive. He was also a PLP delegate to the National Council of Labour, along with George Lansbury, who was then leader of the Labour Party, and Clement Attlee, Herbert Morrison, Ernest Bevin, and George Gibson. All 6 MPs served in this role during the 1930s. At this time, the National Council of Labour, which doesn't exist anymore, represented 3 wings of the movement: the Trade Union Congress, the Labour Party nationally, and the Parliamentary Labour Party. So if we take a look now at Grenfell's international experience, we note that as an MP in 1925, he spent a month on a parliamentary trade delegation to Soviet Russia, traveling as far east as Grozny in Chechnya. Later, fascism in Bulgaria was highlighted by Grenfell, who with other MPs visited the country in 1927. In 1933, the Nazis in Germany defeated the Social Democrats. The Nazis also operated in Austria, and the following year, 1934, saw the Social Democrats lose the Austrian fascist civil war. Lots of Austrian Social Democrats who had impressed Grenfell with their political achievements in Red Vienna fled over the border as refugees to Czechoslovakia. In Britain, the National Council of Labour asked Grenfell and others to go to Vienna at this time. and on his return to Britain, Grenfell called for support for the Austrian Workers' Fund. 1936 saw Grenfell's second parliamentary visit to the Soviet Union, where, after Moscow and the Kremlin, Grenfell insisted on a visit to a collective farm. The long journey to Kharkov, now Kharkiv in Ukraine, allowed observation of rural poverty. The group of MPs returned to Britain via Berlin and Warsaw, where anti-Jewish hatred was evident. In 1936, Grenfell addressed the Labour Party demonstration for peace in Hyde Park, condemning the British government's betrayal of the League of Nations, when Labour was calling for international cooperation to deal with growing threats. However, Labour was also being forced to consider whether it was possible to avoid military conflict. 18 months before Munich, Grenfell visited Prague to make links with the political party, the DSAP. Only two parties opposed Nazism in Czechoslovakia, the Social Democrats and the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. The British Labour Party's links were with the DSAP, the Sudeten Social Democrats. A month after returning from Prague, Grenfell's diary notes Yach, 5 p.m. Yach was the leader of the Czech Social Democrats. National Archive papers show that the British Foreign Office had also noticed this visit of Yach to Britain. Could we have slide 4, please? So these were the people with whom Grenfell made links. And Wenzel Yach was the leader of the party, and he ended up as a refugee in Britain, where he did a lot of work to promote the case of the Social Democrats. Siegfried Taub was the general secretary of the DSAP, a Jewish Social Democrat, and he went to Sweden and the USA. Wilhelm Willy Wanka, we don't hear so much about him, but Grenfell did work with him. He was already in London, and he organised transmigration of Czech refugees from the UK to Canada. With these DSAP leaders already known to Grenfell, the DSAP refugees attracted political attention in Britain in October 1938, because at that date, in the Sudetenland, where Hitler was already, they seemed more at risk than the many refugees who were already in Prague, having come from Austria, Germany, and Czechoslovakia. So only days after Hitler was marching through towns in the Sudetenland, Grenfell was in Prague. He stayed in Czechoslovakia and Poland for 3 weeks, with a few of those days going back to London to press for urgently needed visas. There, Grenfell met, amongst others, with Attlee, and on the 15th of October with the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax. 250 visas were provided for Czech, Sudeten, German Social Democrats. On Monday, the 17th of October, the British Government Foreign Office report shows, quote, maintenance in the United Kingdom of refugees from Czechoslovakia. Draft letter to Mr. Grenfell intimating that the British consulate in Prague has been authorised to grant United Kingdom visas limited for 3 months to 250 Sudeten refugees to be selected in consultation with the first 2 men on the list. So the British Foreign Office was actually giving these people in Prague the job of drawing up the lists of people and talking to Grenfell. 2 days later, in a letter to the British Foreign Secretary from the National Secretary of the Labour Party, J.S. Middleton, the Labour Party confidently asked for embassy support and stated, Mr. Grenfell has returned to Prague to assist in the departure of refugees for the United Kingdom. Requests that the consular officers in Prague be instructed to assist him in his work. It is proposed that refugees embark at Gdynia in Poland. Requests that arrangements are made with the Polish authorities for their transit across Poland. And 2 days later, the story continues with the evacuation of refugees, the text of message from Mr. Grenfell to Mr. Middleton, accepting the offer of 70 berths for the ship Buresova. The message added that consideration is being given to possible dispatch of the steamer Warsaw. A small number of Social Democrat refugees went to Britain before the 22nd of October, but that was the date when Grenfell escorted the first train transport of Czech political refugees out of Prague to safety in Britain. The British Embassy in Warsaw reported, "All help is being given to Mr. Grenfell, who is in Warsaw. No difficulties are being raised by the Polish authorities." Could we have slide 5, please? So the places between Prague and the UK on this map were mentioned by Walter Mykura, who was my uncle, and he came when he was 12. And then when he was 14, he had an article published in his school magazine in Birmingham, which was my journey, and he named all these places. So we had this map made to show. And Nazi Germany was here, but it was also where Austria used to be on the map, because Austria had been taken by the German Nazis 6 months before the Munich Agreement. So it meant that Czechoslovakia was more surrounded. And when Austria got taken, it was nice and easy. Well, it wasn't easy. It was a nightmare, but it was close for the refugees to try and go to Czechoslovakia. So this sort of route, following Grenfell's lead, a succession of volunteer British escorts, many of them women, from a range of British support groups and charities in Prague, used Grenfell's route. Refugees went by train. They travelled east from Prague within Czechoslovakia, then north through Poland to Gdynia, the port of Danzig, now Gdansk. And then the Baltic shipping route went through the Kiel Canal to either Harwich or to London. Can we have slide 6, please? So an important person in Prague was Doreen Warriner, who became the Prague representative of the voluntary British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia. And Grenfell praised her 6 months later, saying, "Splendid work has been done by Miss Warriner and the other ladies associated with her in Prague." And it was a good point to make, because a lot of women were involved. But as history later developed and the historiography of the events, the men became better known, and the women were less known. So Grenfell was supported in Prague by Warriner. She was an academic from London who spoke German and Czech and had visited Czechoslovakia since 1930 for her research. She flew to Prague as an interested, knowledgeable volunteer with many Prague and British connections. And in Prague, she soon met the DSAP leaders that we've looked at, and 2 British MPs, Grenfell and also G.E. Hicks MP, who accompanied him at that time. Also there was the Labour Party International Secretary, William Gillies, a British journalist, and staff from the British Embassy. So straight away, Doreen Warriner was in the middle of what was happening, visiting Grenfell, and they were working together. During Grenfell's initial October 1938 testing of the refugee train route, Warriner took a group of men from Prague to meet Grenfell with the first group in Krakow before returning to Prague. And as Grenfell put both groups of Czech refugees on board the British ship Buresova in Gdynia, Poland, he wrote in his diary, "Auf Wiedersehen 34" to the 34 men. Czech refugees, who included my grandfather, arrived on the Buresova on the 31st of October 1938 at Hayes Wharf in London. Grenfell went back from Poland to Prague, and he continued his work there with the British consul, Warriner, Taub, Yaksh, and others. And in his diary on the 31st of October, Grenfell wrote that he discussed his work in Poland and suggested a courier, and he added, give written suggestion to Warriner. Warriner's description of that date, Warriner's reported description of that date mentions all day at consulates with Grenfell. He said Labour Party would pay. Because the point about these refugees going to Britain was that somebody had to say that they were going to support them. They weren't going to be a cost to the state. So if we look at how and why such close political relationships were being built across borders, we can see that the British Labour Party's political relationships with Sudeten German Social Democrats had been built on common anti-fascist and anti-Nazi politics within their democratic frameworks. Their histories were different, but both were linked to the working class and to trade unions. They were internationalist on both sides. After the First World War, in both countries, they saw peace and progress flowing from solidarity between workers at home and abroad, not from warring empires using working men as cannon fodder. The Labour Party's international secretary, William Gillies, was in Prague working with Grenfell. There is no equivalent Labour Party post today. Gillies continued in 1939 to visit Prague, to meet Warriner, and to help obtain more visas from London. Attlee, as deputy leader of the Labour Party since 1933, played his part. Attlee opposed Mussolini in Italy, Nazi action in Austria, Hitler's dictatorship in Germany, and the British fascist movement led by Oswald Mosley. In July 1934, after the defeat of Austrian social democracy, Attlee flew to Prague for 5 days in solidarity to attend a socialist Olympic Games. These workers' sports events and workers' sports organizations were a feature of Czechoslovak social democracy. And a month after Attlee went to Czechoslovakia, Julius Deutsch, the leader of defeated Austrian social democracy, attended a small British Trades Union Congress International Workers sporting event in Dorchester. The sports festival was to celebrate the centenary of the Tolpuddle martyrs, and the team from Czechoslovakia attended the Dorchester event. Labour Party internationalism continued to build political links in the 1930s. Both Grenfell and Attlee supported the Republican side in Spain, and both MPs had visited Spain during the Spanish Civil War. Grenfell's hometown of Swansea had welcomed 80 Spanish child refugees in 1937. Grenfell himself was on the British National Joint Committee for Spanish Relief. Rescue of European refugees by ship to the UK was not a new idea to Grenfell. After Spain, it was also the method Grenfell used in Poland in 1938. Just before Munich, separately, Attlee and Churchill visited the British Prime Minister to urge him to stand firm with Czechoslovakia. These visits failed. Could we have slide 7, please? So we're going to be looking at one family of Czech refugees, but it's useful to see how that one family fitted into the bigger group. And if we think that the estimated 12,000 refugees from Czechoslovakia in those 2 years came to the UK, we can see that it's like a drop in the ocean compared with the number of refugees who were involved in World War II, beginning, during, and after. So this is This is a small group. And of that group, it's estimated that half of them were Czechoslovaks, 3,000, and the numbers go down. You can see the mention of Reich Germans. That was the term used then to describe Germans who were from the state of Germany. So a Reich German would be from Germany, and a Sudeten German would be from Czechoslovakia. So we'll go on now and we'll look at one Czech political refugee family. One of these, he would have been one, well, actually, no, it wasn't just my grandfather, there was a family of 4. So that family would be from the Sudeten German group. So a Czech German citizen and a German speaker from the Sudetenland, Franz Mykura, born in 1896, came with Grenfell. And Franz was a paid official employed by the DSAP, a former metal worker who had completed his apprenticeship in the Sudetenland before the First World War. And he helped organize the evacuation of DSAP members from his small Sudetenland industrial hometown of Falkenau, which is now called Sokolov. Aided by their political knowledge, they decided to flee in late September 1938, before the Munich Agreement had been signed. This meant the family escaped the Nazi terror in the Sudetenland, including the November pogrom, Kristallnacht, when the Sokolov synagogue was burnt down. My grandmother, Franziska Mykura, was also an anti-Nazi activist in the women's section of the Social Democratic Workers' Sports Association. She decided to leave the night before the general DSAP evacuation from Falkenau, and with cases and a roll of blankets, she took her elderly mother, her 2 children, and 2 neighbours on a night train. Could we have slide 8, please? So the next half dozen slides, which we're going to go through quite quickly, are just giving some background to this family. And on the left was the family of 4 in 1930 in Czechoslovakia, and on the right, later on, in 1945 in the UK. Could we have slide 9, please? So you can see my Uncle Walter here in RAF uniform. That was my dad, and that was the new member of their family that was born in 1941 in Birmingham. So she learned to speak English when she went to school, apparently, but not before. Okay, next slide, please. That's just to show you a picture of Walter Mykura's RAF Green Book. And next, please, slide 10. So this family, the organization called ATUS was important because my grandfather was employed full-time to work as a sports organizer in the Arbeiter Turn- und Sportverband, the workers' gymnastics and sports organizations. And he organized small and big workers' sports events. And this one was for my father in 1936 for children aged between the 8 and 10, a multi-sports indoors competition. And it's signed bottom right by my father, Helmut's father, my grandfather, bottom right, because he's involved in organizing. And could we have, please, slide 12? And this is slide 11, that's fine, yeah. This is Franz Mykura's ATUS little lapel pin badge, which he brought with him, you know, an important little item. And could we have slide 12, please? And Genosse Mykura, Comrade Mykura, this was the high point of his career. In 1924, he'd organised the first international 2-day sports event organised by ATUS in Carlsbad. But then on this date, he organised the Workers' Olympiad Winter Games, February 1937. And the organisation that did these bigger events was called SASI, the Sozialistische Arbeitersport International. Thank you. And could we have slide 13, please? So this is an example of the sort of work that my grandmother did. And it was from a local political newspaper where they reported on what they'd been doing. And it was an afternoon meeting on a Sunday because it was for working women. And these, it was called a sports organization, but it was much bigger than that. They had lots of activities. They did shows, day events, marches, May days. So you can see the sort of things that were happened there. And I like this little description of what they were working towards: peace, freedom, and socialism, striving for a new liberated motherhood. And slide 14, please. The Miners' Institute in their hometown of Falkenau was opened in 1924. This picture is from 2006. And it shows the impressive frontage, and along the top there's a frieze showing a day in the life of a miner. And it starts off in the morning when they go to work, and they go down in the cage, and then later on, this is the cage going up again, and then after that they can be on their way home. And the symbolism above the columns. In the middle, there's the two-tailed white lion of Czechoslovakia, showing that it was part of the Czechoslovak state. It's a very old symbol that was used in the Middle Ages, Kings of Bohemia, for example. And the two symbols either side of the white lion are miners' tools. So it's a hammer and a pick. So this is showing that this is the miners' Bergarbeiterheim, the Miners' Institute. And slide 15, please. This is just to show how long and deep their relationships were, because in 1954, amongst a lot of other postcards, was this one signed by Wenzel Jaksch and other people who had been attending a conference for a new organization that they wanted to have that succeeded the now defunct political organization that had been killed off by the Nazis in 1938. So that's really nice to my grandfather in Birmingham. So I'm going to go back now to talk about this one family of refugees going to the UK. So when they were headed for Prague, they stopped at a little village called Bucany, near to Prague, which they knew because their son had stayed there previously for an exchange visit with a Czech boy. And a young man helped them there, a communist who was also threatened by Hitler. On 4th of October, Adolf Hitler drove through the family's hometown with its renamed Adolf Hitler Platz. And the family was separated after France left Prague on the first train with Grenfell. The Czech grandmother had to be left behind as she could not travel. It was only 7 years later, after the war, that the family heard that she had died in 1942. And as suggested in the Labour Party proposal, this group of refugees that went with Grenfell on the first transport had permission to stay for 3 months. They were billeted as a group, firstly at Dollerbeg in Scotland, at a guest house belonging to the Workers' Travel Association. And 6 months later, the same refugee group, including Rosamund Mykura, appeared to be in a holiday fellowship guest house at Hythe near Folkestone. And Grenfell had noted both these organisations in his diary in October 1938. He was obviously planning what to do with them after they'd arrived. Letters from the Czech refugee group in Hythe appeared in the local newspaper, mentioning that they anticipated going to Canada. And some of them did go to Canada from April 1939. But not Rosamund Mykura, because 10 months after he left Czechoslovakia, he was reunited in Birmingham, in the UK, with his wife and children who had travelled on a later transport. But why didn't they go to Canada? A possible reason was illness. The Czech Refugee Trust Fund papers in the National Archive list money that was given to this family. And with World War II imminent, neither parent was allowed to work, and the family got 15 shillings per week. On behalf of the family, £3 3 shillings had been paid to Queen Victoria Hospital, whose location was not named, and also a very large sum was paid on behalf of the family, £21 3 shillings, to Kent County Council for an unnamed isolation hospital in April 1939. The family's financial support appeared to stop in January 1940. This is likely to be because both the adults appeared at a Czech tribunal and were passed as Czech refugees in January 1940. War had started now, and at the same time, France was directed to employment in auxiliary war services at a named metal factory in Birmingham. 2 months earlier, Franziska Mykura had been permitted to accept domestic employment. Can we go back to slide 3 now, please? Just so as you can see where we are. So looking at number 7 now, the Labour Party proposal and how it was received after Munich. So BBC Radio, the press was part of it, and the BBC was part of it. BBC Radio broadcast a powerful report from its correspondent Ralph Murray, speaking 4 days after the Munich Agreement in a subdued Prague, where refugees were in a stadium. He described the reality of the Munich Agreement, with German troops invading the border areas of Czechoslovakia, along with their well-equipped propaganda vans. Murray witnessed refugees, barbed wire, no man's land separating the two armies, with silently retreating Czechoslovak soldiers who were abandoning Czech war defences before Hitler's visit to Carlsbad. In the United Kingdom, newspapers, including the News Chronicle and the Daily Herald, as well as the influential Lord Mayor of London, were calling for public contributions to their own funds to support Czech refugees. The Manchester Guardian newspaper reported 2 weeks after Munich on Labour's proposal. The newspaper said it came from the National Council of Labour, which urged the British Foreign Office to work with Czech relief agencies in Prague, who were already aware of misery among 3 groups of refugees. One group was made up of Czechs, another was the DSAP, led by Herr Jaksch, and the third was a Jewish relief agency directed by Madame Smolka, about whom we'll talk a bit more later this evening. And this Labour Party proposal helped build some of the future refugee efforts in Prague. The British Voluntary Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia in Prague, headed by Warrener, developed from these existing Prague groups, as did the Czech Kindertransport. Marie Smolka, a Jewish refugee worker, saved thousands from the Holocaust. The Lord Mayor of London took it upon himself to visit Prague with his large fund to be used in Czechoslovakia, and he noted that it would be well used by the British Committee, working with those 3 groups of refugees that had already been identified. And the Manchester Guardian report suggested, and this was attempted to be followed through later, that future Czech refugees would be in transit, arriving in the UK for short periods without the right to work, accommodated in groups and supported by non-governmental bodies until they were moved or could migrate elsewhere. I'm going to say a bit now about which refugees in Prague could not get British visas. Most refugees in Prague after the Munich Agreement could not get visas. There was a vital contrast between the fate of a family of Czech DSAP political refugees, such as the family described this evening, who got visas and escaped to safety before war started, compared with other comrades who did not. Less well-known supporters of the DSAP list, less well-known supporters of the DSAP were not on the list for visas. Although some of the Social Democrat and Communist political refugees were Jewish, their visas were mainly obtained for political reasons. The families of Jewish non-political refugees from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia in Prague were mainly refused visas. Refugees who arrived in Britain without visas could be deported, as seen in the forcible removal from Croydon Airport on the 30th of March 1939 of Oskar Goldberg, a Jewish refugee seeking escape from German-occupied Czechoslovakia. A photograph of this man at Croydon Airport being bodily lifted and carried away was published in the Daily Mail the following day. The violent takeover by the Nazis meant that Jewish people in Czechoslovakia who survived were never reunited with their disappeared or murdered families. Political Czechs who were not from the Sudetenland were also refused visas. Marie Smolka was the representative in Prague of Joint and Hikem, two important Jewish refugee organizations. Smolka was the Czechoslovak representative, the sole Czechoslovak representative on the League of Nations Commission for Refugees. She saved thousands from the Holocaust and encouraged Nicholas Winton to come to Prague. Smolka recommended Winton to Warrener. As a well-known social democrat from a Prague Jewish family, Smolka was arrested and imprisoned as soon as the German army took Prague in March 1939. And as the British-based historian Anna Hadjpova has said in her article about Marie Smolka, no free country was willing to help the Jewish refugees. Smolka did make it to Britain, and she died in London in 1940. Nicholas Winton, who was celebrated in the film One Life, returned to Britain to work on the Kindertransport while Trevor Chadwick took over in Prague. And the Czech Kindertransport organized visas for hundreds of mainly Jewish children who traveled to safety in Britain in 1939, but only on the cruel condition that families were split up. Many parents left behind without visas never saw their children again. Children placed with British families in the UK searched in vain for their parents. 18-year-old Jewish siblings in Prague were refused permission to join their younger brothers and sisters. Kindertransport children were only admitted to the UK if organisers such as Winton could prove to the UK government that volunteer hosts were prepared to pay £50, then a considerable sum, to sponsor these children and house them. So I'm going to take a look now at the time after Grenfell had gone back to Parliament, and that was in the first day or two of November 1938. What happened between then and March 1939, which is when Hitler invaded Prague. So Grenfell was back in Britain, and he was attending the Parliamentary Committee on Refugees, and he was meeting Jaksch and Warrener in London in late 1938 and again in 1939 after they'd left Czechoslovakia. In the spring of 1939, Grenfell reminded Parliament that assuming refugees were a liability to a country is the greatest error. Grenfell said, "We are not at the end of this refugee work, we are at the beginning of it." Grenfell added, "Under the right auspices and with government support and guarantees, we can easily find room in the world for all the Jews who may be displaced in Europe. This, as we know, turned out not to be the case, since governments chose not to offer such support. In the summer before World War II, Grenfell was joined at a Labour celebration in his hometown of Swansea with 3 Czech refugees. One was Jakš, who had, amidst lots of adventures helped by Warrener, got out of Prague and managed to escape from the British embassy and get into Poland. By Jakš, Vanka, and a 3rd Czech refugee, a German-speaking Social Democrat refugee artist, Ernst Neuschel. And there was a new publication for these DSAP refugees that were now in different countries, Sweden, Britain, written by themselves, telling each other what was going on in all the different groups. And the first edition of it in summer 1939, Sudetenfreiheit, it was called, Sudeten Freedom, praised Grenfell, and the headline was "A Friend in Need, the History of a Rescue." And there was a picture of Grenfell and Gillies there, and also Neuschel was pictured in the first edition with his portrait of Grenfell that he painted, that was presented to Grenfell as a thank you from the Czech refugees. A month before the Second World War, Grenfell and Gillies became trustees of the British government's newly established Czech Refugee Trust Fund. Grenfell also became a trustee of a new German cultural organisation that was founded in London in the spring of 1939, and it was called, in translation, the Free German League of Culture in Great Britain. So Grenfell was always a supporter of German culture, German people, but not just the sort of politics that he didn't agree with. Also before World War II, Vanka joined 1,000 Czech men, women and children of political refugees to live in an initially hostile, remote location in British Columbia, offered under the Canadian Refugee Scheme. And we don't hear so much about that at all, but in Grenfell's papers in the archive in Swansea, there's about 20 black and white photos of these refugees sort of landed in the snow somewhere in British Columbia, trying to build resources for themselves, for the kids to go to school or for them to have a cooperative, for example. So Grenfell was in the UK, but what was Warrener doing? Well, this was a really tough time. Warrener and the other teams stayed working in Prague, and like Grenfell, they focused on three things: visas, transports out of Prague, and finances. As Charmian Brinson has said, this was the heroic period for Doreen Warrener and her team. Warrener started off by trying to find 30 places for children who might be sick or needy. In December 1938, she continued the dispersal of the News Chronicle funds that had been collected in the UK and gave them to different refugee groups, including HICM, headed by Frau Schmolke, the Reich Germans, who we've mentioned before from Germany, Austrian socialists and communists who had been exiled in Prague for years. Warrener herself escorted 150 women and children on a train to Poland, where a courier took them onto the port of Gdynia. It was good news when 200 more British visas arrived at the end of December, half for men that were stuck in camps and half for refugees from Austria and Germany. And the new and difficult task of finding accommodation in Prague for women and children awaiting their transport, this fell to Warrener and her helpers. In 1939, in the new year, more money came from Britain and transports departed, carrying German, Austrian, and Sudeten German communists to safety. One train carried 500 Sudeten German socialists. After the success of the refugee transports, understandably, Warrener wrote that February 1939 was wonderful. Warrener's outstanding energetic commitment meant she continued doing dangerous refugee work with Jakš, Sudeten communists, Schmolke, and the British Embassy, until the German army with Hitler marched into Prague on the 15th of March 1939. Warrener went to Schmolke's flat that day to find out that it had already been wrecked. The day before, Warrener, in one of many dramatic incidents, had successfully sent a train full of 500 women and children out of Prague. With Schmolke arrested, Warrener, Jaksch and Taub retreated to the British Embassy. Warrener personally saw off a group of 80 women and children. Later in March, via the now familiar Grenfell route, onto the same British ship, Baltrova, which Grenfell had first used for refugees 6 months earlier. So I'd like to make some closing comments now. We can see that the Labour Party, with its international secretary, Gillies, made good use of Grenfell's international experience, his political relationships in Prague, and his ability to work extensively with teams of people in a fast-moving situation, which fortunately had attracted committed voluntary workers. Labour had strongly criticised government appeasement of Hitler in Parliament and across the country. But crucial was that the National Council of Labour made a confident, timely and positive proposal regarding Czech refugees at a time when press support for Czech refugees was increasing. This was despite the Munich Agreement having had large press and public support. 2 weeks after the Munich Agreement, the British government saw some categories of refugees as more acceptable. And so, yes, Lord Halifax met Grenfell and initially gave the 250 visas and told the British embassies in Prague and Warsaw to support this refugee effort. And those refugees, as we've said before, were required to be supported by voluntary contributions and will be described as being in transit to other countries. Meanwhile, other refugee individuals and groups were ignored, refused visas, or later in 1940, subjected to different punishments, even if they were in the UK, such as internment in the UK or enforced transportation from the UK to Australia. There were other positives arising from Grenfell's success on behalf of the Labour Party in quickly organising and testing his route. It brought some positive refugee publicity in the UK. And this helped in November 1938, when Jewish campaigners encouraged Parliament, who were discussing the possibility of a Czech kinder transport. Grenfell's work in Prague also meant that the voluntary workers, those amazing teams, had 6 more months to obtain more British visas and to use that Grenfell route through Poland before the Nazi terror began in Prague. Thanks to this joint effort, thousands of refugees escaped from Prague before the start of the Second World War. However, many more did not. Thank you all.
Thank you very much indeed, Rosamund. You packed a great deal of information into a relatively short space of time, and you have kept amazingly to time. So thank you again, because that's a major achievement. You've covered so much ground, and there are so many different facets that could be discussed, but I know you've agreed to questions being asked, so perhaps we could then start the question sessions. And that applies, of course, to those who are watching on Zoom. But I think also we might need a moment just to reflect on what you've said. And of course, the people who were not able to come. and those who never made it. Do we have any questions here, please? Karen?
Yeah, I would like to comment, actually, in current Czech Republic or formerly Czechoslovakia, Munich Agreement was not shown as an agreement, but as a dictate. Because first of all, that agreement was never ratified by the Czechoslovak parliament, never signed by president or prime minister. And second, it was the agreement between four powers to give the land in the fifth country to one of those four countries without ever asking the fifth country, what do you think about it? It was simply dictate. And it was first step towards Second World War in Europe.
I would add,
Basically, Second World War started in Asia by Japanese attacking Chinese. Yeah? But it still gets the problems up to today, because you got these German refugees living now in Germany, or their descendants. But anyone who doesn't know about it, it wasn't an agreement, it was enforced.
I would add to that, if I may, that there was actually no Czechoslovak representative at that meeting.
Yes.
Yes,
Don't know what that was. Someone agreeing anyway.
But it was an ambassador.
Someone waiting to ask a question, I think, on screen.
Ah, would you like to go ahead, please? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I echo what's just been said. Apologies, I can't be there this evening. There's no trains out of Swansea for the next at the moment for a week or so. So, yes, fascinating talk this evening. Obviously, we met when you came down to Swansea to look at the Grenfell papers, and I think the message I take back from this is that for DR and others within the Labour Party, talking about international issues wasn't enough, and that's one of the reasons I've put the title internationalist in the book, because I think this was taking an active part in what was happening abroad and seeing the international situation as being relevant to what was happening in the UK, and setting the work of the British Labour movement in the context of the Labour movement globally. And I think that's to me is what's one of the key things about DR's work in Prague. So absolutely endorse everything you've said this evening. And as I said, just sorry that I couldn't be there in person.
Could you please name yourself and also the title of your book?
Sorry, I'm Robert Smith, and I wrote the book DR Grenfell, Socialist Welshman Internationalist.
Thank you.
thank you very much, Robert. Of course, I've made good use of your book this evening, as I said, at the beginning of my talk. And thank you for all the help you've given me over the years in Swansea, which has been really, really helpful. And congratulations on your book, because since Grenfell died, he's been more or less forgotten until Robert Smith's book last year. So 50 years and very little historiography about Grenfell. And so Robert Smith's book, congratulations, Robert, has really filled a big, big hole there.
Well, at least I know one person has read the book, so thank you.
And our thanks for your contribution, because it's a valid point.
And going back to Carol's point, I agree very much, of course, with you, Carol. And some people say it should be not called the Munich Agreement, it should be called the so-called Munich Agreement.
Yeah.
Do you have any other questions, please?
Hi. Yeah, thanks so much for the talk, Ros. It's super interesting. I was just wondering, about this kind of pattern of behaviour in general, like from Grenfell? How unusual was this? Because I mean, I don't understand how other refugees managed to escape and what their routes were. Like how, just to put it in context for me, as someone who's quite naive coming here to learn today, like how unusual was this and everything that he organised compared to the other activities going on to help refugees?
Well, it was like a little window in a little window of time and a little window of place in Prague that just allowed him to be ready to go. That's why I spoke so much about his international experience and about the fact that there was an international secretary of the Labour Party, William Gillis. He'd been in post for years and went here, there and everywhere where there were problems with workers in different countries related to different issues like Spanish Civil War. And so the fact that Grenfell was in a very special position because of his history himself, and the fact that he was setting up the scene to allow himself to have these relationships so that he could move really fast.
Yeah.
But it was just, he was only there for 3 weeks, and the rest of them, these teams of women were there for 6 months. And what they did, although we said it's a drop in the ocean, they were doing what they could in that time and that place. And so it was lucky that the Labour Party had Grenfell, I think. And I don't know if anybody knows a bit about Doreen Warrener, but I think she's somebody who I've heard more than once that she needs a film making about her, not just the famous men, but not decrying their achievements. But
there is a book written by her nephew.
Yeah.
Yes, Doreen Warrener's War, which is very illuminating as well. But there was also, I would add, a whole wave of support following the disaster. Once Hitler had marched into the Sudetenland and people saw and heard about the overcrowding, the problems all around Prague, where there was nowhere for people to go, and the government couldn't deal with this mass flood of people from the north. I mean, they were in horrible conditions that were shown in that film, One Life, to some extent. I mean, I read one report where a child was sleeping in one drawer of a chest of drawers. So this is how some of the funds came about, like the Lord Mayor's Fund. And British people did contribute vast sums of money. They were very, very generous and sympathetic. That's not to say everyone was. I mean, I thought mostly, but the public, the British public in general, was amazingly supportive. And that's how the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia was actually formed and funded. But because it was a charity, it ultimately went bust. But that was not until about this time of year, 1939.
Yeah, I know that the children from Kindertransporten had to have sponsors. However, I was surprised to learn from you that the Sudeten Deutsch had to have sponsors. Do you know how they were found? Who found them?
well, I think they were funded by the British Committee, but I don't know who, right from the word go, for example, paid for them to go to Dollerbeg in Scotland, the first group. I mean, that might have been the Labour Party. I don't know details of that. Don't know if anybody else does.
But everybody had to have a sponsor.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But
Somehow I thought political refugees of this kind would have been just given a visa and a place to live and work. But
utopia. No, I'm afraid not. Clara.
Yeah, I would like to ask, is it possible to find a list of people who got the British visa? I mean, like this first 250 batch of person, and I assume there were other visas issued later. I'm asking because my father left the Prague on 14th of March 1939, one day before Hitler marched in, and he went through Poland to Britain. And he arrived without any problem, so he had to have a visa.
So are you saying he did have a visa?
I'm saying that he most probably had British visa.
He's asking.
Because he wasn't detained, he wasn't expelled.
But some people did have support from
I
it.
wonder how he gets out visa.
I don't know, I'm afraid.
Is it possible to get list?
Well, in the National Archive, there are lists. I don't know if there are lists of all the refugees. But one little project I thought would be interesting would be to look at all the people that came in the first group, because it lists the date they arrived, so you can see who came together, and just to work out what made up that group. If you looked at their age, their sex, their address, their political persuasion, perhaps you could build up a sort of picture. And I know, I think there are some groups. Didn't the Lowit family know who came with their relatives groups?
I've tried very hard. I went to the Imperial War Museum to look at Margaret Leighton's papers there and went through 17 files of information. And it was so frustrating because I looked at letters written by Doreen Warriner saying, thank you for the list of the next lot of people for visas, but there was no list. So there was the correspondence, but not actually the list, because I was actually looking to see if I could find who was on my family's transports, because there were several different dates that my family came in different parts over. But I did, for instance, find, I wasn't expecting, wasn't looking for, my grandmother's side of the family, there was one of her brothers and his wife who were named on the list, a letter to William Gillis, asking for them to get visas from the Bolivian embassy. They were unsuccessful and they died in the Holocaust. But their daughter had managed to marry a New Zealander and went to New Zealand after working in the Bolivian embassy. So trying to piece things together, there was attempts made to rescue people who weren't on the first lot of lists. But, there was a letter from Doreen Warriner more or less saying, we can't help them all. And that was sort of quite heartbreaking to read. And she was obviously having requests from all directions of who to promote for visas. But to answer your question about my grandparents and my parents came to this country as refugees between end of October 1938, and my uncle came out on possibly the same date as your father, the day before Hitler took over. And they didn't have individual sponsors like the Kindertransport, Nicholas Winton's children. They were funded by the Peace Committee for Refugees. And then this gentleman behind me knows Trevor Brooke, who is the History Society in Albury. They were put up in holiday camps and hotels and
Developed a lot of hostels. That was an economic way of accommodating. But there are lists. I have seen lists of names. Some of them were in Margaret Leighton's collection at the British War Museum, Imperial War Museum.
Yeah.
And there are some also in the Czech Refugee Trust Fund files. There definitely are lists. Whether your father is listed, of course.
No, he later worked for the Czech Refugee Trust Fund.
But sometimes people came through friends or family in this country who agreed to support someone's application. So it's sometimes very hard to find precisely how someone came or even the route that someone took.
Mm.
I think the gentleman here.
Yes, it's Robert Smith again, from Swansea. Yeah, I looked at the Czech refugee trust papers of the National Archives, and I think you did as well, Rosamund. And there are some lists there. Whether they're comprehensive, I don't know, because the trust fund maintained a number of hostels in London and I think elsewhere in England as well, and there might have been some in South Wales. And I think there's a story to be told and researched in that in itself. Two things I'd point out. You mentioned Doreen Warren quite rightly. But I think there were other women like Dr. Betty Morgan, who again was involved with the Czech Refugee Fund, disappeared from history, but I think, that there's a contribution she made in relation to Spain and in relation to the evacuation from Czechoslovakia that someone needs to research that, because I think there's a fascinating story to be told there, as there is with Doreen Warren. The other thing which struck me, and I wasn't doing any kind of scientific analysis, it was just qualitative, writing things down as I was in passing, really. The contribution of the Czech refugees to British life, as professionals, as I think they were architects, they were doctors, that there were people, engineers, during and after the war, I think is something that again needs to be recognized, because it does say a lot about what Britain benefited from the contribution of those refugees, and I think that's something that's missing in our historiography at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Maybe I can just add to your question, is that there were other routes concerned the British, particularly to Palestine. My parents went to Palestine because there was no way they could go anywhere else on an illegal transport, and were detained in British detention camps, both of them, for 6 months before they were allowed out. But in terms of contribution, there were Czech pilots, there were the Middle Eastern whole Czech group, enormous unit of Czech soldiers that eventually came to Britain and then through Europe to free Europe. So the Czechs have contributed substantially, I think, but the German or Czech speaking, parents, my mother was a Sudeten. So it was kind of, there's a huge history of the British non-cooperation in terms of allowing refugees. So.
Yes, certainly.
You talked about Franz Mykura leaving Czechoslovakia quite early on in the process. Do we know whether it was because of his anti-Nazi activities in Czechoslovakia? The reason I ask is I have to declare an interest. I'm his grandson. But when I was a young student, I lived with one of France's close colleagues, a Czech refugee called Mr. Zelenka. And Mr. Zelenka told me this story about the Nazification of the politicization of Czechoslovakia by meetings in various villages, where the villages were forced to go to propaganda meetings in the villages. And people like Mr. Zelenka used to organize themselves into little groups of almost like militia, and they would break into the meeting and smash up the meeting and just beat up anybody who was in the meeting, whether they were Czechs or whether they were Nazis or anything, because just people who were attending. And your grandfather and mine, his name appeared in Hitler's Black Book. So I often wonder why he appeared there. If that was one of the driving forces for him leaving Czechoslovakia.
I think the reason he left on the first transport is to do with status in the party, because they chose the people they thought were better known, at more risk. And then the other people if they weren't well known, they, as I said, you know, they weren't on any list. But the 250 first ones were the ones that Yaksh and Taub knew personally, I suppose, because of they were all in the same sort of playing field.
Do I remember that they were all men, the first group?
I think they were, yeah.
The women were left, and they were. I remember hearing from you earlier on that the women were housed in various old buildings.
They were hidden. They were
Yes.
they were in hiding.
Yeah.
They weren't just accommodated. They were in hiding
Right, yes.
because
Around Prague.
in and around Prague.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, because and some of the men too, because they couldn't all go at once, and at times they'd go to the station to catch the train, and then there'd be an alarm, and they'd have to flee again. So it was a dangerous process, but there were some 250 women later in the year,
Yes, yes.
in 1939. Who
Left.
and the children.
Yes. It was organised by Doreen Warriner.
Yeah,
Right.
that's right.
And I think there's another interesting point that I read the book by her nephew, and apparently, what I remember, it was some time ago I read it, he didn't know anything about his aunt's history, until he met somebody at her funeral. She died in 1972, was it? And that's the first he knew that she'd had this amazing, courageous, incredible history. And then he started researching it. And if anyone does know a filmmaker, the whole thing was so dramatic. You can read in his book about it.
Who knew who, and
Yes.
But the links are amazing. I mean, even in this room this evening, and you know, you go through the records. I met that person. And it is amazing how some people survive. And I don't know if anybody knew Hedy Hoonigan, who was hidden on a train, and they had to get off the train, go back into hiding, and then escape again. Try to escape again. So it was a very dangerous process for everybody staying. It's not easy. And it cost money. They needed funding the whole time. What we haven't mentioned, but it's a whole new topic, is the £4 million that the British government provided for the Czechoslovak government to cope with the situation, to remedy the situation around Prague. And what became of the remnant of that £4 million was in the Bank of England. It didn't all go to Prague. And it was on that basis that the Czech Refugee Trust Fund, which succeeded the BCRC, was established. But it was established by deed, and it was a government entity. It was controlled by the British Home Office, and the funding was controlled by the British Treasury. So that's how people were funded, so that they were not a burden, or the principle was that they were not a burden to Britain. And then, of course, when they were allowed to work, they were allowed to work. And also during the war, they contributed to the British war effort as well as the Czech one. Oh, yes.
I just wanted to pick up on some of the commentary about timing risks. So my family were social democratic refugees that came over in 2 waves. So my great-grandfather with the men, but in a slightly later transport in around in February time. He was also on Hitler's list of people that would have been arrested if Germany didn't invade Britain. The rest of the family came in March. and I think would have been on one of the last transports that left Prague. So it's quite interesting hearing
it's
the
interesting.
risk factors that. Yeah.
And of course, Hitler had his agents in Czechoslovakia way before the Munich so-called agreement. And the blacklist was prepared. The first day that Hitler was in Prague, or not, the German army was in Prague, 50 men were rounded up immediately. And that was just the first day, or a part of that day even. So, yes. And there were those who were willing to report on people as well. Yes.
Yeah, my question was, I was wondering, earlier you mentioned that the visas that were given to refugees early on were limited to 3 months. What was the rationale behind that period, and how was the procedure then? Like, did they have to reapply to make a claim or for this status in the UK, or?
Well, I think they said it because they wanted to give them as limited a visa as possible. They were all right. You can come for 3 months, and you have to live in groups and be supported by other people.
The principle was that you did not stay in this country. You were helped to freedom, but you were supposed to be in transit, emigrating to elsewhere.
Britain said,
Applied after the war. So,
and Britain liked the idea of using the colonies. So they used the colonies, and the ones that went to Canada were unusual because they just sort of got in time. Because they had this Vanka man that I'd mentioned organising it. But by the time war starts, you know, everything goes awry.
yes, yes.
So they couldn't carry that through, but they did do things like send people to Australia in 1940 in the summer in terrible conditions on a ship.
What about the ship that sank? Wasn't there?
No,
Well, that was Patria outside Palestine.
no, it was the Arundel Star. That was torpedoed by a German submarine.
That was on the way back.
It went on the way to Canada.
Sorry,
Sorry. Well, I just wanted to.
that must be the last. Please go ahead.
I just wanted to return to the sports.
I was talking to somebody today about that.
And I think that's all terribly interesting, and that there should be such a political organisation arranging sports. I just wonder if it's happened elsewhere, and does that idea still survive?
Usually,
You know,
Universal in
it's,
German.
yes.
your grandfather's role, and your grandfather's role was just so interesting, organising all these international socialist sports meetings, I think.
Well, in Czechoslovakia in the 19th century, gymnastics was really big, and it was part of the culture. So if the Social Democrats and others, there were other political groups had sports associations as well, if they wanted to build community action, a good way of them doing it was to taking what was already popular, building on it and making it much bigger.
Yeah.
And the idea was that you didn't attend and watch elite athletes performing, but you were a community who did things together, and sport was one of them. And if you had a special, like France organised a one-day cycling event in his hometown just after Austria got taken over, and they had teams of cyclists coming into their hometown from quite distances as one part of the cycling event. Then they had outside events, teams of cyclists playing, I don't know if it was football or different things. And then they had a stage show. So they built it up so that it was it was like a day out, and the big events, the 2-day events, were like massive days out, and there's film showing crowds of people thronging these events. They were part of the culture, really.
Yeah, and much more about community than
Very much community, because what Rosamund was referring to is an organisation called Sokol, and the philosophy was a healthy body in a healthy mind in a healthy body. But it was also political and banned by the Nazis because it was patriotic, and that wasn't allowed, of course. But it was not by any means a trend restricted to Czechia. It, as Tony has said, it was also in Germany and the gymnastics side as well.
yeah.
I think we must make these two the very last.
I don't have any connection to Czechoslovakia myself, but your mention about the militia in the Sudetenland, I do know something about that, only a little. A friend of mine who I knew in Germany in the early 80s, shortly before her father died, explained to her that he had been a member of the Eiserne Front, the social democratic militia in the Sudetenland. And she said to him, well, why didn't you tell me? And he said, the Nazis are still here. He spent the whole of his life hiding the fact that he'd actually been completely heroic and somehow had survived all the way through the Third Reich and come out the other side. And yet couldn't tell his daughter until shortly before he died. And I think that says something about the after effects of the people that we don't know about. And it's a rather powerful story, I think.
It was long after my grandfather died, after Franz Mykura died. He died in 1966, and I met this colleague of his in the late 1970s. When he was an old man.
Yeah.
And I think he was quite prepared to talk to me about and tell me about his exploits, because he was telling a young man all about what he did when he was a young man, in his latter days of life. I'm sure that earlier on in his life he wouldn't have been so eager to talk about it.
Yeah.
And that's why, because I've got no idea whether my grandfather was involved in any of those activities or not.
Incidentally, you're talking about the sports clubs and things. During the period of the anti-socialist laws in Germany, one of the ways in which the social democracy organised was precisely by front organisations, chess clubs, theatre clubs, sports clubs, anything clubs, behind which they were actually organising the underground party. And that became part of the tradition.
I think there are many aspects that we could really delve into more deeply, but I fear we do not have the time, and I know people need also to travel some distance in some cases. So thank you all very much indeed for coming. Thank you very much. Such an interesting seminar. If I may just mention the next seminar, which is Hitler emigres in Ireland and Northern Ireland, those who came and those who could not. And it will be given by Gisela Helfter of Limerick University and Noel Russell from Belfast. So they will be dealing with two separate parts of Ireland. As you all know, that there has been conflict in Ireland. So it would be very interesting to hear how the two sections, the two regions, have dealt with the refugee issue.